Welcome to the Naval Postgraduate School Center for Homeland Defense and Security lecture and webinar series. On behalf of CHDS and our co-hosts, the Association of State and Territorial Health Officials, the International Association of Emergency Managers, the CHDS Alumni Association, and the Naval Postgraduate School Alumni Association and Foundation, thank you for joining us. Today, our panel of technology and communications experts will discuss the latest research in disinformation and actions that local, state, and federal leaders can take to counter the influence and impact of online and offline disinformation. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today's webinar. Eileen O'Connor frequently serves as one of our lecturer and subject matter experts on legal and communications topics here at the Center for Homeland Defense and Security. Eileen is the Senior Vice President for Communications Policy and Advocacy at the Rockefeller Foundation. Prior to that, she served as the Vice President of Communications for Yale University and previously as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for South and Central Asia. Eileen has a great field of experience addressing disinformation campaigns as a senior policy analyst, as an attorney, and as an experienced journalist. Eileen, thank you for bringing your expertise to us today, particularly from Rome, Italy, where you're doing a lot of work on the forefront of our COVID battle globally. Now I'll turn it over to you to lead our program.
Thanks so much, Dawn. I really appreciate it. And yes, we actually are in Rome because the Italian government is the presidency of the G20 this year, and they, along with the UK, who are heading up the G7, there's a lot of work going on to build a pandemic prevention system, as well as actually work on a global vaccination program to get 70% herd immunity across the world. And we're going to be also meeting with the World Health Organization and ACT A, and we're going to be actually putting out a global vaccination plan, hopefully next week before the global ministers, health ministers meeting around the G20, or before the World Health Assembly, May 24th. We're still just finalizing that. So I want to, though, introduce our other expert panelists, and we really do have an amazing group today. I'm really thrilled that they were able to join us. Renee DiResta is the Technical Research Manager at Stanford Internet Observatory, a cross-disciplinary program of research, teaching, and policy engagement for the study of abuse in current information technologies. She investigates the spread of malign narratives across social and other media networks. Dr. Daniel Rogers is one of the founders of the Global Disinformation Index, a nonprofit focused on change within the tech industry to disincentivize the creation and dissemination of disinformation. He also teaches cybercrime in the Global Security Master's Program at NYU. And Dr. Joan Donovan is the Director of Technology and Social Change at Harvard Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy. The Technology and Special Change Project there explores media manipulation as a means to control public conversation, derail democracy, and disrupt society. All of them have extensive experience advising Congress, the Department of State, media organizations, civil society, and other non-governmental organizations. You've probably seen many of them on television as well as in the pages of mass media. Some of them have been testifying before Congress even very recently in the last few weeks. And I want to also commend Joan, who is coming to us from her car in a parking garage because she has actually joined us in the midst of a family emergency, but she was still able to join us because we know how important her input is into this. So let me first, one of the focuses of this conversation today, and thank you so much for many of your questions, some of which do actually reflect some questions that were on an earlier seminar, but we do want to put them to this panel because they will bring a different perspective. So, and we also have asked the panelists to really focus in on what you all need as subject matter experts yourselves and those people, and also being people on the front lines. And so practical advice of how you can spot disinformation and misinformation and also counteract it, especially in a public health emergency, but in all sorts of hazards. So first of all, Danny, I want to start with you. You've been running projects to try to figure out ways to disincentivize disinformation. So what have you seen with regard to the pandemic?
Thanks, Eileen, and thanks everybody for joining and for including me in such an esteemed panel here. It's a really salient question. I think the significance of the pandemic is really in that it's very clearly illustrated, and very starkly illustrated, the harms that come from a degradation of people's information environments. So there was a study that was put out by the University of Chicago that directly tied people's health outcomes related to COVID-19 directly to their consumption of what kind of news, which shows on TV that they consumed, for which broadcast news they consumed. Nothing to me was more kind of poignant than that kind of statistical robust correlation between which TV news programs they watch and their health outcomes. People often say, so what, someone's lying on the internet, but the so what is directly tied to people's health, people's life. So the pandemic has really put that on stark display.
So, but what's the motive behind any kind of misinformation or disinformation?
Well, I think the motives are varied. I like to think about the motives in a sort of spectrum of different actors who are either kind of highly centralized or highly decentralized and motivated either by kind of ideologies or mostly kind of financial, right? That ultimately we live in an information environment where engagement, engagement is rewarded above all else. That getting people's attention, capturing their attention, keeping them on your app or your platform versus a competing app or competing platform is how companies succeed and how individuals succeed in frankly just making a living. And so the more sensational, the more unconstrained by kind of boring old reality the information is, the more engaging it will be. And so the information environment, the information systems generally reward that sort of content.
And you can say the same for cable news. I mean, in the sense of,
yeah, cable news is part of the same information ecosystem, right? Fox News is competing with Breitbart, which is competing with 4chan in many ways for people's attention. There's a fixed amount of people's attention, and everyone's competing for it. And so in this kind of environment where those are the things that are rewarded, it tends to extremify the conversation. And so it's a lot more engaging to talk about all of the miracle cures than it is to say, I don't really know how to cure this, right? And so that's what takes over. And then riding along that information environment are, say, particular organized state actors, right? We've seen, Russian actors pushing vaccine messages in order to, talk down the effectiveness of Western developed vaccines in order to help their own domestic vaccine efforts. So mixed in all of this melee, this soup, is state actors, highly organized actors, among all of the grassroots actors, all kind of riding along this information environment in which truth is nowhere on the spectrum of things that are rewarded.
Mm-hmm. So Renee, I want to go to you. What's the difference between misinformation and disinformation? Which is worse? Which is harder to combat?
Yeah, thanks. It's a great question. Very. So I would say to start definitionally, we use misinformation to refer to things that are inadvertently false or misleading. The person who's sharing them or spreading them doesn't necessarily know that they're sharing or spreading something that is inaccurate or produced by an entity that is not what they think it is. With disinformation, we're referring to, the distinction is really an intent. There is a belief that there's a commitment to influence and a commitment to deceive. So the person who is spreading the content or originating the content knows that they're sharing or creating or spreading something that is false and misleading. It's not always false. Sometimes it's just highly propagandistic, highly inflammatory, highly aligned to target the kind of emotional push buttons of a particular group. But that difference in intent is really the kind of dividing line. But as you can imagine, the challenge around ascertaining intent, when we start to talk about what are the things that we can do about this, particularly for tech platforms or for media for that matter, that need to ascertain intent makes misinformation in many ways, I would argue, a lot more difficult to address. And that's because with disinformation, there's often a bright line of inauthenticity involved in a campaign, particularly at the origination phase. Either the actor is not who they're claiming to be, the dissemination pattern is in some way inauthentic, using bots or trying to game an algorithm, that sort of thing. Sometimes the content, comes from hacked materials, for example. So there's certain kind of bright line policies that the platforms have put in place since 2016 to come up with a framework that says this is what we call coordinated and authentic behavior, and we'll act on this. Whereas something like mis and disinformation is spread by real people, usually authentic people, authentic accounts. And the challenge becomes, how do we think about balancing freedom of expression with the right to be wrong, if you will, or the right to share something inaccurate, with the recognition that there is downstream harm or impact from the content itself. And so this is where you start to see carve-outs for elections, carve-outs for health misinformation, because there's a recognition that these are particularly impactful topics that can really materially change a person's behavior or impact a person's life in some very direct ways. And so that's where you start to see policies that are distinct for particular kind of topical or focus areas that are very different from the coordinated and authentic behavior policies that are much more designed to address disinformation campaigns with a clearly discernible manipulative component, as opposed to an incorrect viral rumor.
So we talked before I go to Joan, we talked very briefly, Danny referenced state actors like Russia and China. Renee, what do you see as the worrying trends there by the Chinese and the Russians? I think it's interesting to me that what I saw is, with ISIS and recruiting foreign fighters, and that they use targeted ads to pull people into sort of more extreme websites. The Russians often do influence through online narratives that actually sort of take typical narratives in the United States that are sort of divisive, and they just sort of ramp them up or even spread them into certain audiences that they know it's going to really rile them up. So what do you see them doing, not just around pandemics? I know we started talking about pandemics, but let's just talk in general about the damage and what it is a local leader can look for when they're trying to spot that kind of a thing.
So from state actors, particularly, you've mentioned the two probably best resourced state actors, right? China and Russia. And I think it's important to contextualize that historically as well. So ISIS was doing something very distinct. They were building a brand on social platforms. They were trying to make themselves look bigger. They wanted to be found. All of their content, the iconography was quite prominent. There was a desire to attract people, to create this perception of strength and power. That was the ISIS dynamic. When we talk about Russia and China, we're talking about entities that have a very, very long history of using propaganda and covert measures. The United States does as well, right? This is the sort of great power dynamics. You ask the question of why do people do this? The answer for a troll group may be money. The answer for a state actor is power, right? This is yet one more mechanism, one more channel for affecting a geopolitical goal. And what we see from state actors is full spectrum information operations. So at SIO, we evaluate along a spectrum of overt to covert and then broadcast to social. And so we look at how we don't treat broadcast and social separately when we're talking about information operations from state actors, because they are using both. And that's because they have very, very long established what we call white propaganda or attributable infrastructure, where RT or CGTN is putting out the same message that the covert troll accounts are often putting out. It's just that in one, it's very, very attributable, and in the other, it's covertly done. And so the message, the goal, there is a lot of uniformity there. It's just that you can put out something as an attributable state actor, and you're not going to reach certain parts of an audience, but you can put out that same message using sock puppet personas, agents of influence, to reach an audience where they are, as if you're communicating to them as another person who's just like them. And so it provides a vector for a particular persuasive type of messaging. So state actors, the dynamics are a little bit different because they have this media mouthpiece. They have prestige accounts on Twitter that are blue check that can put out a message. And one thing that popped up this week that was really great was a study out of Oxford. And what they found was that these overt Chinese state media accounts, members of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and such, were saying things, and then they were being inauthentically amplified. So the message is coming from a real person. The statement is the messaging of the state, and then the amplification process is where they're using the fake account. So it's kind of a vast toolkit. You have to think about it as an ecosystem challenge, and they want to achieve a particular aim. These are the tools at their disposal. And so again, we see this overt to covert, broadcast to social rubric. And when we're looking at information operations, we look at it across the entirety of the spectrum.
And we saw this in Russia uses social personas to sort of get people even on the right and the left to go to sort of recruit Black Lives Matter or protests during the elections. And they seem like real Americans, but they're not. And they're actually promoting either sort of a fake protest or some kind of a narrative that is geared to sort of inflame and divide. But so Joan, I want to go to you and say, what are the most effective methods for these folks to use to diffuse and redirect both disinformation and misinformation during the pandemic? And does it matter if some of our audience asked, do you find that healthy relationships with media partners can better impact the narratives online and offline? And I would also ask you, what can you do with social media? I mean, I think all the panelists, you've got experience with, how can local leaders reach out to social media platforms, and should they, to get disinformation taken offline or misinformation taken offline?
Yeah, it's a great set of questions. One of the things that we do at Shorenstein is really try to look at this in a life cycle model of a media manipulation campaign. And so along the way, if you are, say, a city mayor, and your elections are coming up, you might want to take a look ahead of time, right? Just understand what we might call the narrative weather, like kind of take a look at what's out there, take a look at who is interested in different issues, because when there becomes a moment like an election, that's when we see the actors really change what they're doing. So some of the accounts that Renee has studied in the past, these Russian accounts, and we've studied them as well, they were other things before they were accounts that were spreading disinformation. Some of them were just spammy weight loss accounts. Other times they were impersonating protesters. In the US in particular, they do tend to impersonate both sides of a wedge issue, pro-Muslim, anti-Muslim, pro-patriot, anti-patriot, pro-Black Lives Matter, anti-Black Lives Matter. But if you don't understand that baseline, if you don't have a good understanding of like what people are engaged with in your area, when a decision point comes up like an election, it becomes a really big opportunity, political opportunity for not just foreign actors, but really for anyone to hop in and kind of wedge the narrative. One of the techniques, of course, that has become harder to do, but still is very prevalent, is just, as Renee was saying, the use of amplification networks. So you have the information is coming from a politician, but the engagement isn't real. And what that means is not necessarily that the media that they're getting is inappropriate, it's just not earned, right? So all the attention they're getting is not earned. And so this is one of the things that Twitter tried to do in the 2020 election, was they said, well, we're not going to allow for political advertising because it's not earned media. And so to answer the last part of your question about, how platform companies and news outlets might try to tackle this problem, it's really about their dynamics related to if the platform company is stating the policies that they're going to enforce and then enforcing those policies, or if the platform companies are hedging, they're not really saying exactly what it is they're going to do to protect what they call civic integrity. And then when something arises and journalists figure it out, or researchers figure it out more commonly, and then we tell journalists, what happens is you have this dynamic, which I think is actually really kind of ruinous for our society, where the technology companies are now incentivized to hide these things because they don't want the media coverage. And at the same time, you have not a lot of defenses because of the way in which the technology is built, which is essentially for amplification. And so you have this kind of cycle that keeps going on, where hopefully what we see now post, I guess we're still in the pandemic, but as we come out of the pandemic, is that platform companies and media leaders are going to have to kind of reckon with the moment and really amp up the earned credits that advocates have had for years, and create spaces in which advocacy groups can be both validated and also have their issues brought to the fore.
But so, yeah, and I think, this, one of the things I saw when I was at Yale is there was a lot of, sometimes there would be this really very vitriolic accusations against the university. And when we look at what the platform was, it was a bot, or it was someone which had been a plumbing platform before, and it only had like 3 followers. So I think the other thing is local leaders have to pick and choose. What are you going to respond to? Because some of it isn't really going to get that far on social media. But when you, as a big organization, respond or do something, that's actually what they're looking for. And so you do have to discern and do a bit of research on the back end of what these things are. But I would also say, in advance of disinformation or misinformation, is when you're putting out a public health message. Is it helpful, Renee and Danny, to recognize that the kind of misinformation that might come out, like you might say as a public health official, look to us for therapeutics, we are developing those, et cetera. There are going to be a lot of people who will be trying to be selling false remedies or things like that. So how can state and local and federal governments really demonstrate the validity and authority when disseminating information, not just on public health, but on just anything? I mean, example, there was a number of questions about what do you do when you have misinformation or disinformation by neighboring states. And one of the audience members used as an example Florida, where some of the health data was allegedly politicized and manipulated by omission or changes. In New York, there's an investigation on the nursing home deaths and things like that. So what other state and local officials actually do to demonstrate that validity? And what do you do to counter misinformation by your neighboring states?
We've been asking this question in the context of both election misinformation and pandemic misinformation through a couple of interinstitution collaborations that we've been working on. One on the election was called the Election Integrity Partnership, and the current one is called the Virality Project on COVID. And actually what we're doing is engaging with state and local governments and federal government too. We're engaging with civil society organizations, some who are specific to particular interest groups, particular targeted groups who often are as Joan alluded to earlier, we saw a lot of mis and disinformation targeting Black communities during the 2016 election. And so that was a particular concern during the 2020 election and during the conversation about COVID vaccines as well. What we've been trying to do is come up with a way that research organizations can work with these entities to provide a little bit of insight into how narratives emerge and when they require where there's an indication of sufficient amount of velocity or virality, reach, growth of a narrative, something reoccurring that actually makes it something that they should pay attention to. And there's a lot of nuance, I would say, in that, because sometimes basic social listening tools will tell you that your brand has been mentioned 500 times, but they won't necessarily tell you what community, or if it's spreading across communities, or if it's 500 accounts that, per your point, all have 3 followers, right? And so trying to help ascertain what are the narratives that are emerging and gaining, gaining a following across multiple community groups. And then when there's an observed presence of a narrative within a geographical region, if it's particular to a state, or a particular community, if it's targeting a particular interest group, is there then a way, then the question becomes who should counter it, when and how? And so we have articulated some of the, there's some great work done on pre-bunking, the idea that you can, as a state government, for example, put out PSAs that say, look, we're moving into the phase in which children can receive COVID vaccines. Here is what you're going to see. And then really articulate out the types of misinformation that applied to adults, the correction, and then how that's going to be applied to children. Something like the American Association of Pediatrics, for example, which still enjoys a high degree of trust and produces good content, might be the best messenger for that. And so you would kind of come up with pre-bunking to ensure that when people go looking for information, there's something out there. But you also at the same time don't want to call attention to something that, per your point, is like a tree falling in the digital woods, where one account with 6 followers has said something and you have this this overreaction to the fact that someone is wrong online. And so a lot of the work that we've been doing is not only understanding the narratives and the dissemination, but also trying to gauge how these interinstitution or multi-stakeholder collaborations might work for exactly this point. I think this is really an area that's very important for us to understand going forward, because I don't think that the problem is not going to go away. It's more, there's networked activism, there's networked misinformation. So what is the network that we build and facilitate to provide networked good information? And that, I think, is an important area of research.
Danny?
Yeah, I mean, I think I love, Renee, what you said about for example, being able to use data to inform whether or not one should respond to something or not, right? That you don't want to be overreacting or inadvertently amplifying something that wasn't front of mind for everybody, and thus bringing it front of mind. But you also do need to respond when things do take off and become front of mind on their own. 2 or 3 things come to mind. I mean, first, that I think state and local officials are probably in one of the most advantageous places to counter the sort of disinformation that's floating around out in the sort of the information sphere. And that is because people tend to trust their local officials and their local politicians, et cetera, a lot more than they trust officials and politicians at the national level. And I think we saw this play out in the election, that the actions of the local or the state officials in Georgia kind of were pivotal in maintaining integrity of the election in spite of this kind of big the big lie, so to speak. And I think that was a very powerful example of local integrity kind of coming before kind of party partisanship or loyalty to some kind of larger movement or something like that. And so I think that was really a powerful moment and a good reminder. And I do think it's important to educate people in one form or another. One of the most powerful ways to inoculate a population against disinformation is to make sure they're educated about the risk of disinformation. I think in the 2020 election, there was a lot. I saw there was a question that went by, for example, about the Hunter Biden laptop story, right? And I think one of the big reasons that landed with a bit of the thud that it landed with was because for 4 years, people like Joan and Renee have been beating this drum of disinformation and saying this word over and over again, so that and whether it's the work of First Draft and Claire Wardle in behind the scenes in newsrooms or wherever it is, educating people that they are being deceived. People don't like to be deceived, and so helping them realize they may be being deceived gives everyone a healthy dose of skepticism, especially when it's coming from state and local leaders who they trust. Helps build resiliency at that kind of local grassroots level to this kind of thing. So I think those are really key advantages and key strategies, and I do think it's important. I think counter messaging is important, right? I call it the sort of the ground war of disinformation. Is if some viral drink bleach post is taking up people's Facebook page, go buy the rest of their Facebook page with ads telling them not to drink bleach, right? Like the messaging is important, how to do it, but ultimately, like don't seed the ground, right? Send the tanks in, take the space up too, with reliable stuff. So I think I don't know, especially for this audience, I think this audience is in a particularly critical role in combating this, and I think education is really important.
And I would also add that that local news channels and local news websites and local, even though local news has been really hard hit by the influx of ad into social media and online national sources versus the ad buys that were used to be at the local news level. Local news is still widely watched and widely believed, much better than the national news. I mean, Sinclair Broadcasting, which has a network of local TV stations across the country, their statistics show that they're sort of 5:30 to 6:30. That broadcast actually has a bigger audience than all of cable news combined in prime time. So we're talking, hours of cable news in 1 hour of local news across the country. So definitely, I think for local leaders to really, to the point of a couple of the questions, should we, spend time establishing relationships with reporters? Yes. And the other thing I think that's really important is to try to figure out, is there a way for you to sort of segment your audiences, and which is what companies do all the time, and what we at the Rockefeller Foundation do, because we're all about advocacy. So we're advocating for certain parts of certain issues with our research, et cetera. And so one of the things that you want to look at, who are your influencers in your community, and who are those people that, maybe you need to sway to be more supportive of local authorities. And so those are the people you might want to kind of be messaging to sort of pull them in. But at the time of a disinformation or misinformation campaign, it's those influencers that you want to activate, that may be what we call sort of really in your network. And then the other ones are in your orbit. But defining your audiences and figuring out, as Renee was talking about, those communities, which and Joan was talking about, what are the messages crossing communities? When are the communities getting upset? And this is also when you can look at the community groups on Facebook that are in your communities, the PTAs, get into those Facebook groups. When I was at Yale, I joined the student Facebook group. Basically, can't believe they let me in, but to monitor what they were talking about, because a lot of protests would start on campus and I would be able to actually stop them by seeing what was going on in their social media channels and sort of getting out information, literally getting some students to put the right information into that channel, because a lot of times it was being agitated by false information. So I think, using Facebook groups that are in your community is a really good way to counteract some of these things. So Joan, I do want to talk about, an approach to training citizens on how to themselves recognize, expose, and combat disinformation. And Renee and Danny, finally, before we go to live questions, is, that sort of question as well. But also, Renee, you have 3 young children. What's the impact of multiple disinformation platforms on our national youth? This was a question from the audience, who've used social media, internet platforms all their lives. They don't necessarily seek out those traditional news media. Are they going to be more savvy or less savvy? And I'd love to hear your views on that. But Joan, let's go to you first about the best approach to sort of training citizens how to recognize and cope with misinformation and disinformation.
So there's a huge role for librarians to play in this problem-solving effort. And from everything from working with platform companies on the structuring of information so that when people type in things like, did the Holocaust happen, that they get accurate information. But locally, there is a need to reimagine digital literacy, and it begins in libraries. And it begins with giving the resources and the training to librarians so that they can go out and train people in misinformation. So I've done a couple of trainings now with the Medical Librarian Association, where we had several hundred librarians on, just kind of learning about how people receive information, how they understand the internet. Do they even know what an algorithm does and what's important about that? And to your point about these Facebook groups, the reason why they're such a powerful force is because people go back to them daily to keep in touch with their communities. And so What's hard about that is if you have a few pieces of misinformation or a few sort of super spreaders, which all of these networks tend to have one or two people that are centrally the cause of much of the misinformation. But if you do have a way of delivering information through a bunch of different channels, and then also bringing librarians into the conversation, because librarians are really our frontline advocates for truth. They care about knowledge, not just information. And so I do think that there's a much larger role in terms of training and education that could be really a fun way to reintroduce libraries to older people. And I'll kick it over to Renee to answer the question about the youth of today. But I'll tell you one thing I found out recently that I hadn't really thought a lot about is we don't have the same misinformation problems on every platform. You just don't hear the same kind of problems coming out of a place like Snapchat, where a lot of young people use it, and it's actually quite a lot bigger than Twitter. And so we have to look at what's working in other places and then try to figure out why misinformation tends to persist in other places.
Renee?
Yeah, so my oldest is 7. So I'm not exactly like a mom of teens yet, but I will. There's been, one of the he was doing his Zoom as you do in 2020, and I was listening to one of his lessons, and it was how to tell if something is real or fake on YouTube, right? And it was all about this little module. Does Justin Trudeau have a pet house hippo? And there was a video alleging that President Trudeau had a pet hippo. And the point was to like get the kids thinking critically about, is this possible? You saw it on YouTube, but that doesn't mean that it's real. Do people have house hippos? Like, so trying to get them, getting them to think a little bit about it, to realize that not everything you see on YouTube is true. It's really a fascinating dynamic. I mean, my son can, he can read and write, but what he does is he clicks the voice search button, and then the voice search button, he says, show me, what is this? Asks a question, and then asks it as a question, the same way, we would converse. So not the way that you and I do, typing in keywords, probably if you grew up on the internet as it was emerging. And then a lot of the times the results actually go right to YouTube. There's a video that's at the top of the search. And so it's been interesting to me to see that even for 7-year-olds, like the curriculum does recognize that this is how kids get information. They get it from YouTube. And then for teenagers, one of the things that we saw a lot of during the election, and we're seeing it during the vaccine conversation too, for slightly older kids, is TikTok. And it's because the misinformation, particularly about things like vaccines, can be transmitted in the form of like funny memes. There's like a put a finger down kind of meme on TikTok where, kind of highlights issues of privilege or decisions or what have you. It's used in a bunch of different ways. But the put her finger down meme has kind of been picked up by anti-vaxxers who say put 8 fingers down if you're not getting the shot. And then if you take 8 fingers away, you have 1 finger on each hand. It's usually the 2 middle fingers. And that's the sort of meme going around about whether or not to get the shot. Now, as the shot is now available for 12 to 15-year-olds and slightly older as well, we're very interested in seeing how TikTok and the kind of mimetic conveyance of whether or not you should or should not take a vaccine, the inevitability of people who are going to post their first-person experiences with the vaccine, the sort of first-person accounts, that's all going to show up on TikTok, right? And that's because that's where kids are. And that's the remix culture as well. They're going to take the video, they're going to duet with it, they're going to put out their own content talking about their experience alongside this stuff. And we saw that during the election too. And it looks very, very different than the kind of stuff that you see on Facebook and on Twitter, which is much more text-based, because now all of a sudden you're confronting this very different medium of kind of short form videos, which take a little bit more time. It's you can kind of pull insights out of the transcripts maybe, but there's still just differences in dynamics around the substance of the content. So it's, one of the things that we're trying to do is actually understand the dynamics of misinformation targeting this age group. And you asked the question of, are they more or less credulous? I don't have an answer to that. It's not, I don't focus on teens in my own work. So I don't want to overstate or misstate the most recent findings on that. But just as a parent who sees these like house hippo modules, it's very interesting to me that they're going hard for teaching kids not to believe what you see. as opposed to what you read. It's really very much this the recognition that the information is coming in video.
So Danny, I'm going to interrupt you because there was a question that I think I have to take that was about one, as an attorney, one person asked if there could be penalties for disinformation like you have for perjury in court imposed on the media, and also what about the fairness doctrine reinstating that, which sort of dictates that you give candidates equal time, or reform of what's called Section 230 of the Communications Act, which gives immunity to most liability for things stated on social media platforms. They, in the Communications Act, the social media companies argued that they were not publishers, which is how newspapers are actually regulated, and can be liable for sort of purposely false information, putting that out. They were argued that they were just platforms. And there was a hearing actually that Joan was on a couple of weeks ago in Congress, and fortunately members of Congress have now figured out, or at least are getting more educated on what an algorithm is and what it does. And so I think to the first question about imposing some kind of penalty, financial penalty or something, I don't think you can do that in this society because of the predilection by the Supreme Court about, for free speech, and also but I do think that the way people are being punished for that, or media companies being punished, is the pulling of advertisers and citizens saying, we're going to boycott that show, or we're going to boycott this person, whether it's MSNBC or Fox or CNN or whatever. And I think the other thing on the Section 230, there is a big debate. And I do believe that and some of the social media platforms, Facebook in particular, has talked about actually they do think there is a need for regulation, some kind of regulation. And you saw this actually in the most recent decisions by their own oversight board, that guidance perhaps from government would be a good thing. And I do think that this immunity for liability is going to end up getting affected, largely because of the fact that the algorithms are all about profit, and they're all about keeping people inflamed, keeping people online, so keeping you clicking, which then makes more pages turn and more ads come to you, and that's how they're making money. So I do think that there is going to be some kind of a system that would force them to leave some profits on the table. And one of the things I worked with the Nobel economist, Paul Romer, and we were working on, before I joined the Rockefeller Foundation, and we worked on a proposal that the EU is looking at, which would be a targeted revenue tax. It would be a revenue tax on targeted ads. So it would be a rising tax the more that the social media companies use your information to target you with ads, or with things that, like YouTube, those videos that keep coming up suggesting to you, those things can sometimes be profit centers for them. So that revenue would be taxed at a higher rate. So that's another way that there's a lot of different ways that this kind of thing may be able to be at least moderated. So I know I didn't go to you, Danny, but I want to go to Dawn and get to the live questions.
Thanks, Eileen. Several good questions coming in, and the first for any of our panelists. Several folks asking, particularly as it relates to foreign state actors, how can US-based media companies themselves discern disinformation from partners acting internationally to counteract US narratives? Any tools or solutions for our journalistic friends?
Over the years, I've done, I don't even know how many hours of work with journalists on this, and in the question of the problem evolves. It used to be that we would use a set of tools that were social listening tools that would really just show us where the bots were, and you saw a lot of investment in just kind of spotting bots. But then as social media companies learned to counter those kind of tactics, the opponents shifted to other kinds of other styles of attack, and journalists had to adapt. But I will say, there's probably no one in this field that understands more about this than Craig Silverman at BuzzFeed. And if you just follow along with him, he also provides a bunch of trainings and tips and tricks through his Twitter account, which usually leads the field in understanding where some of these foreign influence campaigns in particular are going, and how they're making money and how they're influencing US politics. But the hardest part, of course, is that this stuff is really designed to fool you. And at the end of the day, it still gets us no matter how hard we try or how many different tools and resources we deploy, which is to say that the situation it evolves as technology shifts. And as a result, causes our journalism to have to adapt.
And I think the thing is too, that again, the journalists have to obviously keep really focusing on this and not being taken in. And this, I do think that the standards, I mean, I witnessed it when CNN, even before I left CNN, you know, the standards of when I started in journalism, you had to have at least one on the record, two off the record. I think some of the standards of fact checking within news organizations before you say something has lowered. And I would hope that they would, you know, rise again, particularly now that we know that these foreign actors do have, you know, who are trying to influence you. But again, I would go to the audiences, and are these audiences adapting these narratives? And if these narratives are dangerous narratives, focusing on the audiences and counteracting it, and also making sure that you're seen as the valid and authoritative voices. And as Danny said, you know, and others, flooding the zone. I mean, making sure that you're first, that you are all out there as much as possible.
Renee, a couple of questions coming in from you. We've talked about Russia and China as primary actors in the disinformation space. Folks are wondering, what other international players are we seeing, other nation states that are coming onto the stage?
Yeah, so there's some of my colleagues did some work on this for in a post in Brookings. They actually went through and kind of coded all of the various operations that we saw throughout 2020. So I don't have the stats, unfortunately, in front of me, but it's everywhere, right? So it's been everywhere for a long time. And that's because what we're talking about is an ecosystem that offers certain affordances, right? It provides certain tools that enable people to do certain things. We talk a lot about algorithms, but really we should be talking about affordances, in my opinion, because that is ultimately the kind of core question. Who should be able to do what and to whom? And how do we recognize that affordances, you know, something that's a tool in one person's hands is a weapon in another person's hands? And that gets at the nature of your ability to share something or make something go viral at times is really fantastic and valuable. At other times, it becomes a tool in a misinformation campaign. So when we talk about state actors specifically, Iran in particular has appeared numerous times. In the sense of, if the question is, I was scrolling through, if the question is specific to targeting the US, then yes, the answer is Iran is probably also up there among the big three. But recognizing that this is a global problem, it's important to realize that most countries are actually targeting their near neighbors. And that's because, again, when you get to the question of what is the goal is to achieve a particular geopolitical aim. And oftentimes the sort of, near neighbors are more interesting in terms of, or there's more of a value to potentially influencing the population of your near neighbor as opposed to, a random other country. So there's always a goal to these campaigns. So we see some states operating against their own people. That's another dynamic that happens where the ruling party is operating against an opposition party. And that's usually in service to an election or a policy battle. But so there's this very internally focused stuff. And then when they do look outward, it really is, again, sort of what I've alluded to. The earliest Internet Research Agency operations out of Russia were targeting Ukraine, right? And so it was not, they did not look outward to the US until after. Similarly, China, you see much more the sphere of influence in Southeast Asia as opposed to paying attention to necessarily running these operations against the US. There's a kind of an evolution there. So I would say, some of the most interesting ones and some work that we're going to be putting out is really related to the dynamics in the Middle East region, kind of Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Iran, and ways in Yemen, ways in which some countries become almost like pawns in the narrative where two different countries are kind of fighting against each other, using whatever they have at their disposal, whatever narratives they have at their disposal, contracting out with mercenary organizations. So Saudi Arabia hiring an Egyptian organization to run an influence campaign, pushing out narratives that are putting out the messaging that the Saudi government wants out there. So you really see this, anyone can do it. Everyone is. The affordances have made it possible, and so you see all of the various governments of the world that are so inclined, availing themselves of the opportunity in front of them.
Danny, we have a series of questions here of viewers asking about technology tools. What's the role? How can we tap into AI and other technology tools when human eyes on social media monitoring seems overwhelming in its very concept?
Yeah, it's a big challenge because ultimately computers are good at doing very fast and repeatedly things that humans teach them to do or tell them to do. And so humans kind of suck at being able to figure out what's true and false. So there's no reason to think computers would be any better at it. In fact, probably a little bit worse. So I think the field of like automated fact checking at scale is science fiction at the moment and likely for the foreseeable future. I think it's about kind of dividing up the problem between what are people good at and what are computers good at. At least in our own organization, we've tried to kind of tackle this by saying, well, people are good at identifying kind of content related to a topic, and computers are good at finding a lot more content just like it. So and it all kind of starts with your definition of disinformation. I saw a lot of questions go by around like, how do you tell if something's true or false? I think the biggest trap is getting stuck in a kind of true-false dichotomy-based definition. I like to say that the true-false definition of disinformation fails the most basic test, which is what I call the Santa Claus test. That like, if it was really about something being true or false on the internet, we'd all be clamoring to like deplatform Santa or the NORAD Santa tracker every winter. So it's not just about somebody saying something untrue on the internet. It's much more about what we call kind of like adversarial narrative conflict, and this idea. So another test I like to cite is the Breitbart immigrant crime test. So Breitbart famously had for a while a section of their website that was immigrant crime, and it was just a collection of sort of cherry-picked stories about crimes that happened to be committed by immigrants. And if you put that to the kind of strict fact-checking test, they probably all passed, right? They were all crimes. They all happen to be committed by immigrants. So technically it was all true, but because it was curated into this section on their website, it was peddling this narrative that, first of all, was misleading. And statistically speaking, it was trying to peddle this narrative that like immigrants disproportionately commit crime by only showing you the crimes that immigrants committed. That is statistically not true, and so there's a misleading element to it. More importantly, it's adversarial in nature, right? It's an anti-immigrant narrative that's being peddled, and most importantly, it carries with it a risk of harm. And specifically, that's the kind of content that fuels violence and hate crimes against immigrant groups. And so to us, by starting with a definition like this, so this gets us to a useful definition, which is anytime somebody's peddling either implicitly or explicitly a narrative that is misleading, that is adversarial in nature, and that most importantly carries with it some risk of harm, that is disinformation, at least to us. And that's a very helpful definition when trying to kind of automate technology, because we define, instead of developing a overarching disinformation detector, we define what are these adversarial narrative topics that are kind of front of mind right now, and we expertly identify content that instantiates those narratives, and then we can just simply use technology to identify more content like it, and that helps us track at least long form open web content at scale in a pretty effective way to say this website is peddling a large volume or large density of anti-immigrant content or of QAnon content, et cetera, because we've identified beforehand using kind of expert input what that content looks like. And technology happens to be very good at that. So there are ways to do it, but the sort of holy grail of like a computer telling us what's true or false is not really the right approach. That definition is also useful in helping a lot of other aspects of the debate, the policy debate, for example, right? Like instead of focusing on regulating truth and falsehood, you can now focus on regulating risks of harm, right? And you can start to see the problems with seemingly the more fanciful stuff like UFO conspiracy theories. It's not the UFO part that's the problem. I mean, I'm a physicist by training and have plenty of physicist friends who spend their days listening to radio telescopes looking for extraterrestrial life. It's not my career choice, but it is a perfectly valid one. It's the conspiracy theory part that's trying to kind of degrade trust in the government, right? If they're lying to me about UFOs, they must also be lying to me about the COVID vaccine and wearing masks, right? And then all of a sudden, there's your risk of harm. So having a workable definition is the first step to both, identifying what is technologically automatable and to helping kind of address the problem and approach it from a sort of regulatory perspective too.
Eileen, I think we have time for one more live question, then I'll turn it back to you and our panel for closing comments. Several viewers have asked, can disinformation ever be used for good? And an Arab Spring example was cited in one question. What are some of the ethical complexities? So outside of the communications and technology realm and the philosophical realm, thoughts from our panel on whether disinformation is empirically always a bad thing?
Well, I would argue that there wasn't disinformation in the Arab Spring. There was explosion of information in the Arab Spring because we saw what the protesters were protesting about. And so I think I would argue that disinformation, which is, again, not misinformation, which is a mistake in information that's spreading, but disinformation, I think, is inherently always bad because its intent is bad. And just like the Russians, you have, what Danny was saying is it's so hard because I know that the Russian narratives always have a kernel of truth, and that makes it very difficult to discern. But the narrative is designed to actually divide. It's designed to undermine our democracy. It's designed to undermine confidence in government. And by the way, mostly confidence in each other and trust in each other. And that's what's so scary about disinformation. It's really incentive to divide and to destabilize society. So I would say mostly no.
Eileen, with that, I'll turn it over to you and our panelists for some closing thoughts.
Well, I think I'll just leave it to Danny and to Renee, because I think that was my closing thought. And I guess the only other thing is this is tough, and it's really going to take resources too, unfortunately, that I know state and local officials do not have. But it's just a lot of work as well of relationship building, of just sort of research into who are those communities and when should you message someone, direct messenger, and ask them to start putting out messages. And so it's a little labor intensive as well. But it's critically important. And I also think it's an important topic to bring up publicly, the particular damage in lives, particularly as we've seen in the pandemic, that disinformation and misinformation can cause. Danny?
I don't have much else to add. I mean, I can certainly answer that last question, which is, I think you're exactly right that, like, in going back to this what I said before about the definition of disinformation, right? It implies, a malicious act, and therefore, I think universally is, but it's separate from lying, right? Lying can be, morally ambiguous in times, but disinformation, which is adversarial and harmful in nature and malicious, is not simply lying, right? So answering that question, but I think more generally, just to close, I would just say that, the fact that over 600 of you are here today talking with us about this subject is in and of itself a victory and key to the solution. That merely by all of us talking about it and being aware of it is one of the most effective ways of disarming it. As I said, nobody likes to be deceived. So the fact that we're all sitting here talking about how there are people out there trying to deceive us with malicious intent is itself a big victory. So my hat off to everyone on the call and everyone who's joined today, and thank you all for organizing it, because I think that's a huge part of helping fix it.
Yeah, I don't really have much to add beyond that. I agree. I think it's continuing to move forward through multi-stakeholder relationships and raising awareness, and that's how we're going to tackle this.
Concluding thoughts on this, I've been very excited by the desire to tackle the challenge and to name it. And for me, you can find most of our research at mediamanipulation.org, but we do have a primer out on mitigating medical misinformation that does have a rubric in it where we really wanted to help public health officials figure out who their allies are. And in this moment, I think what Eileen brought up earlier about building relationships with local journalists, especially local television journalists, I think is going to be crucial for the road ahead. And I think that's because people are going to shift to other places to get verified news as the information environment on social media becomes more and more polluted and difficult to navigate. And I also think it's really important that we don't give up, which is to say that it can feel really overwhelming when you're doing this work, when you're looking at disinformation day in, day out, and you're wondering, like, how can this keep happening? How do they keep getting away with it, to sort of quote the meme? But ultimately, a whole of society solution is inevitable, which is to say we need policymakers, we need strong policy, and that might need to come from the states because it's probably not going to come from the Senate or Congress anytime soon, on privacy in particular, to stop with, all of the ways in which you can monetize disinformation, but also enrolling more technologists in our public officials' workaday world, so that we understand what we're up against. And lastly, I'll say that there is a broad role for mayors in this moment to step up and lead the charge and be vocal advocates for the truth, which I think that's really what keeps me in it. And I'm hoping that other people on this call feel empowered to step up and to start sort of laying the tracks for the road ahead.
Joan, thank you to you, Renee, Danny, and Eileen for moderating our conversation today. It was a pleasure and just one part of an ongoing conversation that we're hosting to look at mis and disinformation topics. There'll be more in our upcoming series to come. On behalf of the Naval Postgraduate School Center for Homeland Defense and Security and our co-hosts at ASTHO, IAEM, the CHDS Alumni Association, and the NPS Alumni Association and Foundation, thank you again for joining us today.